Gallaudet University presents.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edgar Palmer, and I'm the Associate Dean responsible for the Office of Diversity and Equity for Students. I'd like to present our speaker for today. I met her yesterday in our first meeting for the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. And we met together all day, and it was quite a good meeting. I think that those of us who were in attendance would all agree. Let me share with you a little bit about Dr. Smith. Dr. Daryl Smith is currently a professor of education and psychology at the Graduate University, Claremont, California. She received her bachelor's degree in mathematics from Cornell University and a master's degree in student personnel and counseling at Stanford University. She earned her PhD in psychology and higher education from the Claremont Graduate School. In 1968, Dr. Smith joined the faculties of Scripps and the Claremont Graduate School as an assistant professor of psychology. She has also worked for the Claremont Colleges Consortium as Pomona College's Assistant Dean of Students. And she also worked as Dean of Students at Scripps College. In 1983, Dr. Smith was appointed Vice President for Planning and Research and Associate Professor at Scripps. She became a full-time faculty member in psychology and higher education at Claremont Graduate University in 1986. Dr. Smith's research interests center on diversity in higher education, evaluation and organizational change, college governance issues, women in the academy, women's colleges, institutional research, student affairs, and classroom teaching. She has lectured on these topics to wide audiences as keynote presentations, invited speeches, and many plenary addresses as well throughout the world. The courses that she teaches include the college student experience, organizational implications of diversity in higher education, the governance and politics of higher education, adult development, and institutional planning, assessment, and change in educational settings. Her most recent book, Diversity's Promise for Higher Education, Making It Work, is published by Johns Hopkins University Press as of 2009. This book serves as a model for much of Dr. McCaskill's work on diversity and inclusion here at Gallaudet University. It's being used to guide us in our work on diversity. I've actually read her curriculum vitae, and I have to tell you, she has published many, many books, many research articles. It's phenomenal. The list is endless. I'm not able to cover all of them. But on that note, I'd like to take an opportunity to welcome Dr. Daryl Smith. Thank you, and welcome to Gallaudet University.
I'm delighted to be here, and I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to put myself in the hand of such talented signers who tell me what to do, don't forget sight lines, look at who I'm talking to, and who'll occasionally pull me back from the edge of the stage if I wander too far. One of the things I want to do today is make sure that I leave time for questions. And I want to make sure that what I talk about today is useful to you. Because one of the things I've learned about diversity issues, if it's not useful, then I feel like my time here was useless. So I'm going to try to make sure we have time for questions so that you can come back and say, but what about here? I've used here the title of my book in part because of your president, who conveyed through Angela that the key with diversity these days is about making it work. What we know from decades of work, probably centuries of work, is that just putting a bunch of diverse people together doesn't just work. And if we need any examples of that, we can go around the world and see how diversity in communities doesn't necessarily produce thriving communities. Our agenda in this country and in our universities is to produce thriving, diverse communities that work. And my work has been about under what conditions can we make that happen. So that is sort of the frame for what I'm going to be talking about today. And I want to set a national and to some degree a global context for this work, because it's very important that we recognize that in the work on diversity in higher education, we have 50 years of unfinished business. The agendas about race in this country and to some degree white women in the sciences, race, gender, and class in this country are unfinished. We've made progress. But one of the dangers today is as diversity gets broader in its encompassment, that we lose this sense of the unfinished business. And so I want to make sure that in everything we think about, the unfinished business with respect to race in this country does not get forgotten in the conversation about diversity. At the same time, we can see in our diversity conversations increasing domains. And as I come to Gallaudet, I can tell you the domains even get more interesting. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you'll recognize some of this. One is the role of religion. Particularly after 9/11 in this country, we began to recognize that we had very little capacity to even have thoughtful conversations about Islam in this country. And this is the first time I've used the word capacity. So that's the word I want you to take away with today. What we're talking about is how do we build institutional capacity to engage these issues of diversity. But the role of religion, as we all know, is becoming increasingly important on our campuses and our society. This is in honor of Gallaudet, language and communication. It's your language, it's your central focus, and it is critically important as we begin to think in the Gallaudet context about diversity. You know that even within the deaf and hard of hearing communities, there's a tremendous amount of identity issues, diversity issues, and dynamic issues of communication that just makes the conversation about diversity even broader. We know that there are human rights and equity issues throughout the world that have to be attended to as well as here. One of the things that's been really clear to me as we engage topics of conversation about diversity is how do we deal with histories of violence and injustice? One of the things is you look around the world and say, under what conditions did diverse peoples come together, particularly people who have had histories with one another? And here I like to think about South Africa. Is that one of the essential elements is that we have to deal and name and address the histories of violence and injustice. And one of the challenges for us in the United States, I think, is we tend to want to think that was then, this is now, let's move forward. And so dealing with histories of violence and injustice can't be it's too difficult, it's too painful, let's get over it and move on. Because in fact, people bring their histories with them, and unless they're addressed and acknowledged, we don't move forward. We now know that the health and well-being of societies will, in large part, be based on the degree to which inequities of salient identities, whatever the identities are that are salient in different cultures, are addressed. We know that violence, the probability of violence in a society increases as inequity increases. So if we want to have a healthy pluralistic society that works, given our contemporary demographics, we'd better deal with that, or we can look around the world and see what that might look like in the negative sense. We also know that we have to address health and education disparities. This is now becoming an urgent national priority. The future economic well-being, political well-being of our society will depend on our addressing educational disparities. The healthcare community is now placing healthcare disparities as almost number one on the list of issues to be addressed. Not diversity issues to be addressed, issues to be addressed. But disparity, in fact, in our society plays out very much in terms of salient identities of race, class, and gender, as well as other. I mean, we're in a community which acknowledges that deeply. We know that immigration in the last number of years is the next big wave of immigration has transformed the demographics of our society. So we can't just talk about diversity as a domestic phenomenon. We've got all kinds of new communities that have entered into the conversation. And one of the tensions is, how do we address new communities when we haven't finished addressing old communities? And my own caution here is these are not either or, they're both and, but we have to do it very carefully and thoughtfully. Multiple and intersecting identities. One of the challenges in our historic discourse on diversity is a singular notion of identity. And in my book, some of you have read it, I began to look at what is the contemporary understandings of identity, both institutionally as well as individually. And what we know are a few things. Both institutions and individuals have multiple identities. They intersect in very interesting ways, and they emerge in different contexts, right? So they're not fixed. So I'll presume to give an example here. If you're in a deaf community, then other kinds of diversities might pop up. The minute you step over into hearing communities, the deaf identity may be salient because of communication and language issues. So we have to understand, in fact, one of the things we were talking about at Gallaudet is how do you increase people's capacity to talk about the complexities of identity without reducing the salience of identity to people in a way that allows people to talk across difference. And you have some of those issues even within the deaf community, who was born hard of hearing, who came to it later, signing, speaking. These are complex and very real issues that are core to questions of identity and have to be addressed in very complex ways if they're going to be addressed well. We know that indigenous communities now fight for issues of saliency, viability, and sovereignty. Now, this is something that's very relevant to a place like Gallaudet, which is the issue of diversity in science and technology and our domestic capacity. What we know is we are not producing in this country the domestic capacity in the science and technology fields. A little factoid for you. 85% of the Asians getting their PhD in this country are non-citizens. That's of Asians. Such that Asian Americans are actually getting fewer PhDs than African Americans. What this means is, and it's perfectly lovely to have international folks here. I mean, it adds diversity, it adds richness, but the reality is, if we think that the science and technology community needs to be built in this country, we can't rely on folks who increasingly are going home to build higher education systems at home. Higher education is a very important thing around the world. And the days when we could assume people would stay here is not something we can assume anymore. So science and technology for any higher education institution, if you look at the dropout rates in those fields, if you look at diverse students and where they end up, critically important. And of course, the demographic shifts of our society are huge. So this is just a quick, I hope you can see it with the light. The important point here is that of young adults ages 25 to 29, this is as of 2006, so we're already 6 years ahead of this, 59% white, 20% Latino, 13% African American. So the nature of our society, who we talk about when we talk about higher education in this population is not only for the general population, but for young adults, hugely diverse. So whenever we look around our campus, not just at the undergraduate level, but the graduate level and the faculty level and the staff level, we have to say, are we engaging the diversity of our society? Otherwise, as an institution, you're beginning to say, okay, we don't need to pay attention to that group of people. We'll just target ourselves to a narrow group of people. And of course, in this world, you can't afford to do that. Now, here's where diversity often gets into trouble, and I'll go quickly through this. The rhetoric is increasing because of all the issues I described. The list of diversity identities grows. We have sexual orientation. We could spend some time having a workshop here about all the identities that are salient. Wheelchair access, deafness, age, class, gender, race and ethnicity, international. We could go on and on about the important identities that often become part of the diversity conversation, sexual orientation, and now in the last number of years, transgendered folks. I don't know if you've got to that issue now, but everybody is. What's happening is the programs and projects are growing because people are thinking programmatically in response to different identities and issues. The undergraduate student body diversity is growing. However, graduation rate disparities on most campuses persist, and I'll give you yours in a minute. But the challenge is the human capacity for engaging these issues is not growing. We are not growing it in staff, in leadership, in the faculty, and what often happens is it's the person in the diversity office with 2 people is the capacity we turn to deal with all of these issues. The other challenge that is very important to recognize is the conversations and the task force reports could be 40 to 50 years old. I often go to campuses and I read the latest. So I read your diversity plan, and somebody yesterday said, how many times have I been through a diversity plan? Why is this one going to be different? But in fact, on many campuses, I could take the date off and put 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, and the issues and recommendations wouldn't be that different. And critically for my work, competing views of whether progress is being made. So if I'm a leader, if I'm your president and provost who are here today, and thank you both for coming, we always have to mark progress. So if I'm the president, I'm going to mark where we've made progress. If I care about diversity institutionally, I'm going to sit there and point out where we haven't made progress. And what tends to happen is this gets to be a hard conversation. We talk past each other. And I can tell you that that is very depressing from a leadership point of view and from a campus point of view. And that's why we get so much more excited about geothermal projects on your campus or a new building. Much more gratifying than our traditional conversations about diversity. So this competing views of progress is part of what leads me to do some of what I do. What I do. In addition, and this is where you're not doing this, which is good, diversity efforts are often parallel to core functions. Now, in a time of limited resources, limited staff, budget cuts, et cetera, you tend to want to pay attention to core issues. And often what happens at diversity efforts is they're parallel. We have a diversity plan, we have a diversity this, that doesn't in any way intersect with core functions. Accreditation, I'll go to a campus, read the accreditation report, I have nothing about diversity in it. And yet I'll show you how diversity is core to excellence. So we have to be very careful about that. Diversity is also mobilized after a crisis. So let me just tell you, if you have a crisis in the neighborhood or on campus that has to do with race or anything, you'll have a crisis, all the attention of the campus will be focused on it, and we'll mobilize, at least for the next few years, until we move on and back to the usual. Sound familiar? The other thing we've learned about diversity is that difficult dialogues are difficult. we don't naturally come to have difficult conversations together. And one of the things that I've heard about the discussions here is you have a particular additional set of layers about difficult conversations that are difficult. And that is, who is deaf? How do we engage the different kinds of hearing communities? What happens to hearing and speaking people here? How do we engage these complexities? And the challenge for higher education today is we have to build our capacity. And I don't just mean student capacity. We have to build our capacity. We have to teach people. How do we engage these difficult conversations so we can create communities that work? And my kind of strange way of thinking about this is, if we can't at a place like Gallaudet, how do we expect Los Angeles, New York, or our Congress to do it? And now, I see my format has changed here, and now what's happening, and I want to be very cautious with you about this, internationalization and globalization. Isn't it interesting, and it's always been the case, that higher education gets globalization? There's nothing more exotic than building a campus somewhere else or having a partnership around the world. And I spent time in South Africa. I really value that. These issues play out around the world, so I'm not diminishing that. But all too often, our internationalization issues, one, get done much faster with much more significant consequences than our domestic diversity issues. And we think they're substitutable. So if we have a lot of international students, we think that's diversity. So if we have Africans, well, then who cares about African Americans? Well, the reality is these are very different kind of things. Many of the folks coming from around the world are quite privileged in their own cultural context. It's not clear to me we're educating them about the issues of diversity in their own context at home, about structural inequities, about salient identities, et cetera. So this is a very important thing to think about and be very intentional about. So for me, the next generation of work has to be reframed. And I think about it as building institutional capacity for a pluralistic society. Now, one of the things I've learned is those of us who've been doing this work for a long time tend to think about diversity in a particular way. And I've struggled for many years with how do I help people understand what I'm talking about that's different than the history of the work we've been doing. So I want to shift the paradigm. And here I want to think about credibility of the institution, the viability of the institution. So think about that. Gallaudet's credibility if it doesn't deal with diversity, Gallaudet's viability as an institution if it doesn't deal with diversity, and Gallaudet's capacity to do this work. And here I want you to think for a moment about technology. And here's the parallel. I'm old enough to remember when technology was new, but I can tell you that when technology was understood to be an imperative in our society, in our environment, first of all, campuses understood they didn't have capacity. Most people on college campuses didn't know what they were doing. Faculty would argue about the definition of computer literacy. And the debate in those days was, could you be computer literate if you only knew word processing? Or did you have to know in those days, some of you will remember Fortran? Big debates, which are now useless, meaningless. But lots of things happen when we understand that technology is an imperative. And there are a number of parallels. Those of you who've read my book know that I really sort of played with this I almost started the book on this, because what happened? When we understood technology was an imperative, it affected our hiring, it affected our curriculum, it affected how we build buildings. It affected how we understood we were seen in the outside world. So, and it doesn't change. So we're in the middle of a financial crisis, it's hard times, but if enrollment management needs new social media, and we don't have the capacity to deal with Twitter and Facebook and all of those things, what do? Somebody sign an answer. What did we do when we don't have capacity? You hired somebody. You built your capacity because it was an imperative. Yes? It is also the case that it never finishes. So the minute the iPad came out and it didn't use Flash, I have never seen campuses move faster to change Flash on their websites to something that the iPad could use. It wasn't an issue of we don't have any money, maybe we'll get it, maybe it'll be hard. It was an imperative. There is no way that a viable institution was going to be able to function if they didn't stay up with technology. Do you get my drift about the parallel? What I would say to you is, just as technology has been imperative in our environment, given the changing demographics and the changing world and immigration patterns, diversity is now a reality in our environment that if we don't build our institutional capacity for, which we had to do with technology, it's not like everybody knew what to do, it will affect our long-term viability and success as an institution. So the key principles going forward. Diversity has to be part of the mission. Why is this essential to this institution? So often with diversity, it's about admissions, and it looks like the University of Michigan, Gallaudet, and a local community college have the same mission. Well, they don't. So part of the question here is, why is this central to Gallaudet? It has to be part of core indicators of success, and I'll show you in a minute what I mean by that. It has to be beyond projectitis and programs towards synergy and coordination. We don't have the resources to just proliferate stuff that doesn't produce real change. We have to monitor progress. I remember talking to a college president, and I said, how do you know you're making progress on diversity? And the president gave me a list, an ever-increasing list of stuff they were doing. But that really did not reflect institutional change. So we have to know how to monitor our progress. And we have to think of diversity as inclusive and differentiated. And let me just take a second to explain that. On many campuses, the default is to have diversity as a laundry list of all the diversities we talked about. So it's a list. It produces a lot of tension on a campus because, for example, with the historic unfinished business of race, it makes race just one of a million things on a list. On the other hand, from my work, if I understand inequity, if I understand that people are not engaged in the institution, why would I say I don't care about that identity, I only want to care about this identity? So if I came to Gallaudet with all its commitment to deaf and hearing impaired communities, and I didn't see wheelchair access, shouldn't I ask myself, why shouldn't I stand for wheelchair access? At the same time, we can be inclusive, we have to be differentiated. The issues for gay and lesbian folks on a college campus are different. We're not talking about hiring. We may be talking about domestic partner benefits. We may be talking about climate. We're talking about wheelchair access. We're talking about something different than signers. So what we have to say is we have an inclusive understanding, but how this plays out in our campus and what we have to address will differ, depending on different communities. And if you really want to be an inclusive, diverse community, you have to attend to this. It's not all one and the same. Some of you have gotten pretty familiar with this framework for diversity. I was pushed to define diversity years ago, and I thought, And I realized as I studied higher education and studied institutions in higher education that there are 4 domains of much of this work. They're centered on the mission of the institution. We can see a global and local context for it. But there are 4 domains that I think capture a lot of the work going on. The first is access and success for students. And for me, I tend to emphasize in this dimension of historically underrepresented students. So we don't lose the heart and soul of where a lot of this work began years ago. As we begin to look at the Asian population changing in this country, there are going to be other communities that are not historically underrepresented, but are clearly underrepresented if you think about the Hmong community in this country, for example. But for me, it's about access and success of historically underrepresented communities. The second dimension is climate. How does this place feel? And you've got a lot of issues that have been identified about climate issues. And I've added intergroup relations. As you become more diverse, the capacity to talk across boundaries becomes more and more important. And what I've learned since I've been here is even within the deaf community, there are hard conversations to be had about these issues. The third is the core of the mission of the institution. It's the academic purpose, education, scholarship, and research. And this is not just about groups and their concerns. It's about what are we educating people for? Everybody. What is it we want people to leave with when we think of our society and it's changing? And the fourth is the institutional viability and vitality dimension. This is sort of at the institutional level. I think of this as the faculty and staff diversity, your leadership diversity, your strategic plan. To what degree is diversity embedded in core functions? So these are the four dimensions that I've lived with. Until I went to South Africa and then came here, you've added a fifth dimension, which is wonderful. Because language and communication is an important part of that, not only for Gallaudet, but when I came back from South Africa, issues of language are hugely significant in a country where there are 11 recognized national languages. And how do you do 11 languages? So let me connect this to excellence and Gallaudet. So this is the special purpose mission of Gallaudet as I read it. A bilingual, diverse, multicultural institution of higher education that ensures the intellectual and professional advancement of deaf and hard of hearing individuals. That's your mission. Now, the recurring statements that go around this has to be about student success, right? I mean, if you're an institution of higher education, particularly with a mission of Gallaudet's, you want people to leave here empowered and successful. So student success. You're also about preparing everyone to participate in a diverse society and to empower people in the community to participate and succeed and to empower others to work with the community to participate and succeed. You want to be a leading research resource for internationally about the issues of deaf and hard of hearing. That's your research imperative. And you want to serve hearing students who want to work in careers that serve the deaf. I think I've got your language right. So that's the sort of generic statements about success and mission. So where does diversity come in if we just wanted to look at those elements? Well, the core issue here is our students from different groups succeeding. So unless you're prepared to say, well, what we mean by student success is just the aggregate number of white students or some other group of students, then you wouldn't care about which groups of students are succeeding or not. So one of the core metrics for diversity is student success disaggregated by, given our history, race and gender. Are all students being prepared to function in a diverse society, and how would we know it? What are the critical lenses they bring? And critically for every institution, but I should assume for Gallaudet in particular, how attractive is the institution for diverse groups? So if I went out and said Gallaudet in diverse communities, would people say, oh, that's a fabulous place, or would they say, I'm not sure? The future of Gallaudet, the health and well-being of Gallaudet, of course, requires that when people go out and talk about Gallaudet from different communities, the word on the street is good. We need to pay attention to whether the faculty and staff from different groups are succeeding and thriving. If you've got a lot of turnover that reflects some of the issues in the environment, this is a problem, because what you want in a healthy institution, that is that people are thriving. If the human capacity of our institution rests on the faculty, staff, and administration, then those groups of folks need to be thriving. What is the capacity to facilitate difficult dialogues? A lot of campuses struggle with that. It's amazing how teaching and learning centers are doing technology workshops for faculty to build their capacity for using the iPad and clickers in instruction. But we're not addressing that. It's hard to have difficult dialogues, and it's hard to lead difficult dialogues. So some of the work that's going on here is really very important and a good model for the rest of the country. And then how robust are institutional relationships with diverse communities? I was on a campus recently that's quite close to a number of Native American reservations. This is a campus in where American Indian students graduate at the rate of 20%. And yet this is a campus that says we're going to have robust relationships with tribal communities nearby. And I'm thinking, if I were in that tribal community, why would I think well of this institution? Every time I send students there, they don't succeed. So this issue of how are we viewed, how robust are our relationships, is very important. Climate is always a messy thing because it's about lots of things. But for me, if I were to have my druthers, I would begin to say, how would we know we have an inclusive, supportive climate? And for me, this is about students, faculty, and staff. These are the metrics that I like to look at. Satisfaction, disaggregated by various groups. Again, faculty, staff, and students. Choose to come again. Virtually every survey that you look at, whether it's for faculty, staff, or students, will ask the question, would you choose to come again? Or would you recommend it to a friend? Now, if you disaggregate that, the question is, who would recommend it to a friend and who would not? Because that is very important as part of your public persona, your PR, but also just the climate on the campus. So would you recommend it to a friend? And the last one, which a few places ask, but actually is turning out to be a very important predictor of success for faculty, staff, and students, is perceptions of commitment to diversity. We don't know so much about what that means. But what we know is that when you're in an environment, diversity work is not easy. And there are a lot of days where you just want to give up and go home or build a new building because it's just not easy. But if it turns out you are in an environment where you perceive that the institution is really working at it, it impacts satisfaction and success for many groups of people. So perceiving that an institution is committed, which means the message, do I feel like we're all working on it together, or do I feel like I'm the lone person struggling to push rocks up a hill? I hope you can see this. This is just a very simple graph of the 2005 cohort 6-year graduation rates. And the important message here, your overall graduation rate is 41%. African Americans, 14%. Now, Native American, 57%. That, if we looked at over time, we could see that you're doing really well, or it bounces because your N is so small. If you have 2 people and 2 graduate, that's 100%. But the important message here, and you've got these data on the book, is that there really are gaps among the graduation rates of different groups. And I put over here male and female because you haven't yet disaggregated or intersected gender with race. And what I know happens in many campuses is that there are real gender gaps within groups. And so it looks here like you do have a gender issue, and so I would want to look at race and gender across different racial and ethnic groups. And what's so important to me is if I were looking at this at every level, this would be an urgent matter of concern. This is not adequate. And it's not adequate not only because if you're saying we need to be successful and empower people to go off in the world, this graduation rate says unless they're transferring somewhere else, they're leaving with failure and debt. And that's not a very pretty picture. So this is an urgent issue. And what I feel on most campuses, and I won't speak for this one, is this is one of just many things that the diversity plans include. And there's no sense of urgency. So one of the questions you all want to ask yourself is, to what degree as a collective community do you perceive that improving the graduation rates for students from diverse groups is urgent? And there I'll use another technology example. How long would you tolerate the email being down? As I've been here, people have said a minute, maybe 2 minutes, 30 seconds. How long would we tolerate it for the web being down? Not very long. We would know this is an urgent imperative, not something optional. Technology is not optional. No excuses need apply. Just fix it. Well, my view about graduation rates on most campuses is it needs to be fixed, and there are things you can do other than becoming more selective, which most campuses can't be, to really, we know what it does to improve student success. We know, in terms of lessons from research, when done well, diversity has educational benefits. We know that engaging diversity actually increases cognitive complexity. We know that good education matters. If you think it's okay for student success to be predicted by zip code, then do nothing. But if you think that good education matters, you can change the pattern of student success. And here are sort of the 3 legs of a stool for me. High expectations. So we're not talking about lowering excellence. High expectations. Belief in students' capacity even when they don't believe in themselves. And I assume you get a fair number of students who may or may not have been thriving in other educational systems when they get here. And whether it's graduate work or undergraduate work, especially in the sciences, we need to begin to remember that our role is to believe in students even when they don't believe in themselves, and the necessary support to get them there. And you get that when it comes to how do we support people in the deaf community, and those patterns still applies to diverse communities of all kinds. We know that perceptions of institutional commitment are important. We know that this must be tied to excellence and accountability. This is not just do good work. Turns out to be do good work. But it's not just do good work. It's an imperative for excellence in our society. And domestic and international are not interchangeable. They add something, but they're distinctive. And when I tried to think of an example, somebody told me, which fits here, I think, just like with accessibility on a campus, just because you have wheelchair access doesn't mean you have access for hearing impaired folks or blind folks, right? They're not interchangeable. Doing one doesn't give you a check mark. So we have to be very careful with the international agendas that they don't be seen as a substitute for some of this work that we must still do. We know that identity groupings are very important, and increasingly what we want to do is have people identify the multiplicities of identities and engage across boundaries. We know that intergroup relations are fostered when you can see both commonality and difference across different groups. So it's a very powerful strategy for building community. We know that leadership diversity is very important at every level, from the cabinet to the faculty to the staff and students. I played with this mission, mattering, and multiplicity, 3 M's. Diversity has to be core to your mission. People have to feel they matter, that their work is going to make a difference. And we have to encourage multiplicity. So we want to encourage people to bring all their identities. We don't want to say, well, some identities count and some don't. And we have to be very careful, because in diversity work, unlike technology, myths and reasons for failure are the order of the day, whether it's faculty hiring or student success. Student success is about K-12, faculty hiring, there aren't any, they wouldn't come here, we can't afford them, et cetera. So we have more myths and assumptions for lack of progress on diversity than we would tolerate in every other domain. If you were a vice president for advancement, development, a fundraiser on a campus, in the middle of this budget crisis and financial crisis, which we would all agree is there, so we're not going to dispute that it's hard. If you had a vice president for advancement who came up to your president and said, sorry, I can't raise any money, you know, look at all the problems that everybody's having, that person would be fired. We might modify our goals, we might set realistic goals, but we would not tolerate myths and reasons for failure. We would expect success, the same with technology. Yes, it's hard. In budget times, you don't have the money just lying around to replace all the computers. But you better do it. When you added Twitter, you better do it. You can't function in the world unless you do that. So reasons for failure are a dime a dozen on diversity. And expectations for success is what has to happen. What has to happen. Faculty diversity, similarly, very slow to change. My urgency about this one is, and I don't know about Gallaudet because I didn't have those numbers, the next generation of faculty are being hired. I've estimated that on most campuses I've been to, we've already replaced 1/2 to 2/3 of the faculty. And it's not diverse enough. So it means that we're hiring the next generation for a whole generation. If every hiring cycle is not more diverse, we're going to have the same conversation 30 years from now. On many campuses, and I don't know that it's true here, international faculty are being hired the fastest of anybody. Isn't it interesting how we managed to get legal and visas and all the complications of getting an international faculty member to have a proper work status, and yet when it comes to domestic faculty, we can't seem to find anybody or do it. There is a lot of issues about turnover and retention. There are a lot of myths and reasons. There's a lot of, we had one good year. I was on a campus. They still talked about the year 10 years ago when they hired one African American, as if that solves the problem. And the reality is that hiring is a central component of perceptions of commitment. When you ask if an institution is committed, well, yes, the undergraduate student body being diverse is lovely. People look at who's being hired. They look who's on the cabinet. They look who's on the faculty, senior administration. That says we really are committed to collecting a very diverse group of people and recognizing the talent that they bring. It's huge. Now, I'm not going to go. Now, I'm not going to go through this list. It's, for those of you who've read the book, it's in there. But what's turned out from the research is that the rationale for diverse leadership has been very undeveloped. What we say is role models for students. And yes, role models matter. But the fact is the demography of most decision making, the group of people sitting around the table, this is why we had the big discussion about gender in the Supreme Court, right? You can't be a pluralistic democracy that works if everybody's sitting in the Supreme Court are white males, and it has nothing to say that they're necessarily not good white males. I mean, there are many white males who I would agree with more than some white women. But the issue is the absence of that kind of diversity sends a big signal as to where talent is, where we can identify talent, and how we see talent. We know that the diversity of faculty increases the kind of research being done. We know that the more diverse your faculty, the more community outreach and engagement, the more legitimacy. Most campuses wouldn't assume to go to China, for example, without hoping there was somebody who has Chinese descent on their campus they could bring with them to legitimate that presence on their campus. Well, the same is true in all our diversity. You know, we're going to go out in the local community and we look around and the one person of African American descent here gets dragged out to every African American community event because it brings legitimacy. Well, we can't have that kind of differential impact of just one person or two people. It matters for institutional attractiveness. One of the keys here that I think is so important is the absence of, and this affects Gallaudet especially in its mission. If you look at the diversity of faculty by race and hear about hearing, it's the absence of diversity that sends a message. If I'm Latino and I've never seen a physicist, or if I'm a white woman, I've never seen a woman engineer, it's the absence. And if I've done a study where I took the top 50 research universities and just counted the number by race and gender across the faculty, the zeros in most departments. The chances that anybody who would have had exposure in the classroom to somebody who was different than themselves is palpable. I mean, it's just a problem. It's zeros. So the absence of diversity in the faculty, in the senior administration, is a very important thing about, for legitimacy, for the quality of decision making, The other is the burden on tokens. The reality is if you don't have sufficient capacity, then the same few people get called on to do the same things. And that cannot go on. And what happens with that is people get burned out, and they say, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm just going to go back to my classroom and do what I do. So until we have sufficient capacity around our tables and in the institution, we are going to be short of people who can bring the diversity of perspectives we so desperately need. Now this Now this may look, I hope this is clear enough. This is the faculty demographics by race and ethnicity, and I only had 2 years, 2009, 2011 at Gallaudet. The bottom line here is underrepresented minorities, no movement. African Americans declining as a percentage. Latinos increasing. And what I'm not sure is these are Latinos, domestic Latinos or international. American Indians staying the same. And you can see white over here. I didn't see many international faculty, but that just may have been how the numbers were categorized. So for Gallaudet, some of the issues here are new hires that can get monitored. Historically underrepresented minorities and Asian Americans, not really much change. I think there's probably a turnover issue, which you can calculate with 3 numbers. It's very easy to calculate. I just didn't have the data to do it. It's really important to separate out race and gender and citizenship on this to kind of begin to discern where is an international perspective and where is a domestic perspective. I don't know about how well you're doing in the sciences and technology fields, both at the undergraduate, the graduate, or faculty level. Graduation rates by race and gender are clearly an urgent issue here and can be dealt with. And it sounds like there are climate issues for faculty, staff, and students that really do need to be addressed. So the implications here is we've got to focus on student success and learning. There are all kinds of good practices for that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Hiring is critical. You probably want to ask about program reviews and where diversity is and your program reviews. Fundamentally, this is about attractiveness and monitoring your progress. So what are the simple, instructions for leadership at all levels, a framework, which you've been developing, metrics for monitoring progress, key, simple, elegant metrics that are tied to mission and excellence, not so much tied to diversity, it's tied to core institutional things. It's got to be central to mission. It's got to be communicated. This cannot be done on an episodic basis around campus, or people don't feel that the institution is committed and moving. At the same time, you can't have just a wonderful message and no action. So it's got to be aligned between the message and the action. It's got to be intentional, aligned, sustained, and accountable. We all know that we're all very busy. There are too few people here to do all the work to be done. So if it's not important, then maybe I just won't do it. We know what important looks like. We see it. We can think about it here. When you've understood something was important to Gallaudet, what did it look like? And have you ever seen diversity look like that? Probably not. And your approach has to be inclusive and differentiated. It is not about choosing one or the other, but it's not a laundry list. And the international, which is terribly important and vital in a global world, is not interchangeable with the domestic issues that diversity raises. So, what makes an institution attractive? You've got success with students, faculty, and staff. You're inclusive. You do interesting work that matters, which you certainly do. And you have a good reputation for students, faculty, and staff. That's really what you're trying to achieve here in terms of excellence, and what I think you're poised to do now, and I wish you the very best of luck. Let me stop there. Thank you. we have some time, I think, for questions. We're asking for people to come to the front with questions so it can be properly communicated.
Hello there, Dr. Smith. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. My name is Fred Mangrabang. I'm a professor in the Department of Education. And I see this shared with, oftentimes we have a great many white faculty and staff, and then Asian and black faculty and staff are very underrepresented. And so from that, I see that there's a lot of work to be done here at Gallaudet. People will come when they see themselves in the experience there, how we experience that gap and close that gap. Then we have to see that that gap is closed. That's critical.
So one of the issues is a vicious cycle, right? You don't see it, then it's not attractive. It's not attractive, you won't see it. Is that part of the question that you've got? And one of the most difficult things, and this speaks to the climate, when we do faculty searches, we often try to put faculty who represent some form of diversity on the search committee. And what we want is for that person to speak well of Gallaudet. Come here, join us, and we'll do good work together. Sometimes people feel like they can't say that. And that's where I do worry about we've got to make sure the climate is being addressed so that people have integrity with respect to selling Gallaudet to prospective students, faculty, or staff. So it is very important. And one of the big challenges for institutional leadership is to hear the truth about what's going on and then do something about it. So we need to make sure that if you're on a search committee, for example, you feel good about saying, come to Gallaudet. It's not that Gallaudet doesn't have issues. Every institution has issues. Every institution that I know of deals with racism or sexism or homophobia or whatever the issue is. So no place is ideal land. But when you feel like the institution's committed to moving forward, then you feel better about recruiting people to come. And that's why it's so infuriating often when people, predominantly white folks, for example, say there aren't any, they wouldn't come here. Because often the communities on that campus know full well there are people. They would come here if you recognize their talent. But you will never, if you don't see them, they won't come. So I hope I've spoken to your.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to ask a question about faculty attitudes. And using the example of my son. My son attends Towson University and is now a junior, majoring in business and computer information systems. My son's taking a programming class this semester, and on the first exam, well, the first quiz, he didn't do well because he hadn't yet purchased the book. But he was advised by the faculty member to withdraw from class after only one quiz. Now, for me, that begs a question of whether or not the teacher is taking the responsibility for teaching and for developing students, improving students. It seems to me that that's a missing element. Now, to parallel that, the issue regarding African American students here at Gallaudet, we know for a fact that many of our African American students don't perform well in ASL. So again, there are attitudes, I think, that emerge on the part of the faculty with regard to how to address that in teaching and learning. How can you respond to that?
Yes, that's a very important thing. I'm a social psychologist, so I tend to think about behaviors first and attitudes last. If I wait, as we did with technology, if we waited for everybody to get on board, we'd still be waiting for the first computer. So for me, the question becomes, how am I being held accountable, or how is my department being held accountable, or my school being held accountable for the success of students in our areas? So if I'm a historically black university, for example, I can't not have black physicists unless I want to not have a department. So we're going to make sure we're identifying talent, we're bringing them in, and we're keeping them there. This story you told is very common. It happens in organic chemistry, people who are pre-med. Somebody comes in and struggles with something because it's new, they're not familiar with it or whatever. And isn't it interesting, the differential advising? So if you're a white woman in engineering, maybe you shouldn't worry about engineering. Why don't you go off into, so in some other field where you might be more successful? When in fact it has to do with pedagogy or the climate, or again, belief in students when they don't believe in themselves. And I think that one of the things that happens at the department level, the department chair, is how are we doing with students from diverse backgrounds? And if we're finding them, and you can track this, going off the track on a regular basis, and I think of organic chemistry as the gateway courses. Any of these courses that provide gateways. The old model was the weeding out model. Look to your left, look to your right, only the best get through. That model, the mathematicians were the first to end that model because nobody wanted to go into mathematics. Now all of a sudden is how can people love mathematics? So I think part of the issue here is the degree to which you're tracking students getting diverted from some of these fields. Talking with the deans and department chairs say this is not okay. You're not going to be able to do that anymore. Then you have to build the faculty capacity. If I've been teaching the same old way or thinking that excellence looks the same old way, then I have to help faculty engage student success writ large. And what I know about the research on student success is what I've listed here that applies for underrepresented minorities, for example, is good practice for everybody. And we've had too many examples in the STEM fields especially where people hit a barrier and they're gone. And we cannot afford that in a society. Now some people may move because they truly change their interests. That's fine, but that's not your son's example. And so, but on the street, down at the level of department, we know that's going on. So if I'm a department chair and I begin to see that groups of students are dropping out after the first quiz, I want to talk to the faculty member about that. It's no longer acceptable. But it has to be done in the institutional context of we are committed to student success here. Because otherwise it's an individual phenomenon. It's this dean or department chair talking to this faculty member. It's got to be a collective enterprise, like technology was. When we knew we had to build our capacity for technology, there were plenty of faculty members who didn't want to join. But it became really clear we'd better do it. We tolerated a few outliers. So I hope that speaks to.
Of course, being in education myself, I encouraged my son to persist in the course. And naturally he did. He's doing just fine, by the way.
Well, and you know, apropos of our fetish with tests in higher education, there's a lot of wonderful work, Carol Dweck is one of them, that shows that folks who have motivation and resilience, when they hit a rough moment in the road, are more apt to go further than the ones who've never had to worry about success. They hit a rough road and they collapse. She's doing a lot of work with professional athletes as well because of that. So you want people to stick it out and then provide the necessary support.
Hello, I'm Brandon Williams, and very often one problem that I've seen is that, I mean, look at our audience right now. You don't see any students here hardly, and that's been the case. We host dialogues, we host workshops, things of that sort related to these important topics of diversity, but the problem, again, is that students don't go. And it's sad, but even as a student here, I've had that experience of oppression every day. Every day I've experienced that. People who, do oppress, who are not open to people of difference, they're not going to come to this. And this is something I consider to be an important workshop. What would you say is the one thing we could do to encourage them and get more student participation in these events?
Well, I think the reality is, and this is a common, people will sometimes say to me, you're preaching to the choir. People will say you're preaching to the choir. And what I want to say is the choir has to sing better. So part of this is the degree to which it's an imperative, and it's embedded. Everybody is very busy. There are a million things on the calendar. So unless you're already committed to it, now you say, I might go. But it's partly an issue about where do existing, this is the parallel processes. So in addition to things like this, which are fine, I was meeting with a bunch of folks who really do bear the responsibility for carrying this forward. But reaching out to the student government groups or the fraternity, whatever groups there are, many campuses are finding that engaging diversity in terms of what does it mean to be a thriving organization, whatever your organization, is a good way to have that conversation because it's core, not optional. And so, you know, people are busy and you'll get, but I think the important thing is the folks who are here, do you see a different way to talk about this that's core to excellence and mission? I have to say to you, and I think it's a credit to you, that both your president and provost are here and many of the deans are here. This is hugely important. I can't tell you how many people look around a room when I go to a campus and don't see their president and provost and wonder whether once again they're the ones doing the work and the senior leadership doesn't matter. So this is a fabulous way to start. And then the question would be, from your point of view, how to bring this conversation to students on real issues. You know, something that's theoretically interesting. I'm busy. But if we've had an incident, we'll have a conversation. Or are there things that are already going on where we can embed this? So for example, one of your learning outcomes is identity and culture. Well, if that's going to get built into the classroom experience, believe me, we'll have a conversation about multiplicity and intersectionality and how we talk to each other. In our classrooms, we can have a conversation among people who don't usually see each other. Very powerful for students. And it has wonderful learning outcomes, including critical thinking. What the researchers have discovered, not surprising, is that when we hang around people who are like ourselves, we get into habitual thinking. And diversity interrupts habituated thinking and requires us to think. Isn't that a good educational outcome? Critical thinking.
My question is quite similar, actually. Considering your work and your publications and all you've done with regard to institutional metrics for change and examining institutions at different levels, both the department level, the administrative levels, I wonder, though, how do you affect change on personal levels, on individual levels? What can we do about administrators, faculty, or staff who are, to say, apathetic, who believe that if it's not broke, don't fix it? How do we get the message through to them? You know, the technology comparison is kind of apt in that, but how do we get them to change or start to care about students of color or queer students or any of the other things at a personal level? That's one of the keys here at this university.
And I think this is where we talk about accountability and a sense that this is not optional. At the individual level, you know, the question is, what do we do with bullying behavior, for example? Well, we have to help people know that they have to stop that, even at the daily level when they encounter it. But we have to help people understand to do that, because most people don't want to. But what I've observed, and you can see it in your own life, I'm sure, when you sense that this matters and I'm going to be held accountable. So if I'm a faculty member and I'm being asked to incorporate diversity or identities and cultures, and someone actually looks at it and sees if I'm doing it, and then if I say, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to have that conversation, now we have a teaching and learning resource that helps me, then it matters, and I'm not being blamed. See, I think part of the issue with our diversity discourse is if this is about capacity, very few of us have really lived in a thoroughly diverse world where we've moved comfortably in and out of all environments. This is a new environment for me. I'm learning how to do it right, how to not step in people's sight lines, right? So we have to help people build their capacity. That's the first thing at the individual level. But what I know is, if I'm the president, I want this in every one of my senior administrative portfolios, and it has to matter. It has to be tied to our viability and our excellence. If I'm a provost, I want the deans. Then I want the department chairs. Every search committee has to have this conversation, and our curriculum, program reviews, accreditation all lend themselves to that. By the time you get to that level, the only people who are sitting there going, don't bug me, are a kind of people who begin to see themselves as the outliers. The problem now is too many people see themselves as the mainstream and the diversity folks as the outliers. We have to shift that. Will there be always individuals who don't care? Well, depends on in what ways they don't care. If students are thriving and succeeding, fine. But if they're not thriving or succeeding, if I'm a faculty member, that's not okay. Because you're doing damage to Gallaudet's and its students And in that sense, given your mission, you're doing damage to Gallaudet. And that's not acceptable. That cannot be tolerated. And that's why when I don't see urgency when I go to a campus about the graduation rates, I go nuts. Because I just think of the damage being done, even as we're talking about student success.
I like to engage with my interlocutor. One of the things that occurred to me when I saw we have the issue of the same people always being called on to do the work, particularly anyone, staff and faculty of color who are burdened with this work. Brandon's comment about who's here and who's not here. I think as a student I would say, oh sorry. I'll start again because the captioning didn't keep up with me. The issue that I wanted to touch on is the issue of the same people having to do the work. People of color always being the people who are given this responsibility, and also relating back to Brandon's comment about if I were a student and I came here and I didn't see my professor here, I might conclude that my professor doesn't care about this issue. So my question to you is, what can we do with the faculty that don't have the knowledge, because that's a big issue. You have to have the knowledge. Since 1975, I've been doing this work. When I started as a teacher in Boston Public Schools and took desegregation training, the second year of busing. It's been 37 years, and I'm still going and taking courses. It's a never-ending process. People will do it for technology. How do we get faculty to do it related to increasing their capacity for diversity and integrating it into their courses and pedagogy?
I've actually done research on this, and it turns out getting the faculty engaged is not as difficult as we stereotype them. And one of the most effective strategies campuses can use is a thing called re-granting. Little pots of money that acknowledge that when we're doing our work in the classroom, it's built on our expertise, it's built on our capacity that might have not covered everything we need to know. So part of it is, does the institution help build my capacity to honor that, but also to expect it? You know, that we're going to participate in this. But re-granting, small pots of money, it doesn't have to be big amounts of money. It turns out gets more faculty out than the campus had little pots of money for. Because what the institution is saying is, this really matters to us. And we know that not everybody's had the experience or success in doing it, so come along. I was just on a campus, the faculty don't show up for workshops, but they had a pretty powerful example of conflict that wasn't well managed in a classroom. And the faculty are coming out of the woodwork to say, help, I don't know how to handle conflict in my classroom. I don't know how to have a race conversation. I don't know how to have a sexual orientation conversation. Help me. So the proper response from the institution is to bring someone in who'll work with the faculty on an ongoing basis, not just a one-shot thing, to help them navigate what is a pretty scary thing for most faculty. So I think you can do it. But again, the message has to be, this is important. You just leave it to the folks who are doing it, then you'll get the folks who are doing it.
Hello there. My name is Elvia Guillermo. I'm with the Multicultural Student Programs. I'm the coordinator. And Gallaudet has issues with regard to hiring and promotion and longstanding issues of favoritism rather than looking at best qualifications for a position. That's been longstanding, and not just at the administrative and faculty level, but also with faculty, with students even. And interviews are often conducted where people have already made a decision on the basis of administration favoritism. And that's one of the reasons that I believe you don't see a lot of diversity in terms of the faculty. So when faculty or staff are selected by means of favoritism, then they have a learning curve to begin to really know their programs, and then then they can start to carry their programs more effectively. Whereas if a person was selected who had the qualifications initially, the programs could be up and running. And I think that's a long-standing issue. How can we really stop and put an end to that sort of favoritism cycle and create a different Gallaudet?
One of the things that I've heard since I've been here, which is only since Sunday, so forgive me if I'm speaking inappropriately, is there's a culture that goes way back of practices and values and ways of doing business that have come forward. And one of the challenges, if you are at a moment where there's an opportunity for change, how do you make sure that the future is the dominant thing, and you hope that people trust the rhetoric to begin to say, okay, I'll give it another try, because people are quite cynical about what you just described. But I think it has to be explicit. And then the processes, when I do my work on faculty hiring, I call it interrupting the usual. So whatever the usual practices are, we have to interrupt them. Joanne Moody is coming next week. She'll work with a lot of groups. She is fabulous at this. So I think it has to be named, the history, and say, we really do want to move forward. And that means job descriptions, how searches occur, and it's not about who you know, because in fact, whether it's within the deaf community or within racial communities or whatever, that kind of practice doesn't put the institution in good stead going forward. In the sciences, for example, people will often say, well, we only want the best, and if the best means you came from a certain school and people we know. And what I wish for in every job description in, say, physics, which is not ethnophysics, is we want to bring in people who have experience and success in working with our students in the sciences, for example, and diverse students. We want people to bring their expertise so we don't have to keep training them going forward. And it's amazing what that does to the pool of people who apply. But now you've got to make sure that the search committee is truly open, and that means who sets up search committees, the chairs need to be really clear what the agenda is. The metric for the institution going forward is the diversity of new hires and the diversity of the faculty as well as the staff. All of these begin to interrupt patterns. Because I can tell you, search processes are not easy. It's much easier to do it out of your back pocket. We're all busy. And the reality is, if we're going to change something, it has to be interrupted. And part of it is to trust and to give trust for a moment anyhow to people who say, look, that's the way we used to do it. But this is the new Gallaudet going forward. You've got new leadership. Let's create the Gallaudet of the 21st century. Because I do believe that when it comes to diversity, the future of Gallaudet, for example, as the complexities of the deaf community grow within the community, and again, I'm speaking ignorantly, but I've been listening, you can't keep attracting a narrower and narrower pool of people, or you won't have people coming to Gallaudet. People have options. So in order for Gallaudet to be attractive and successful, it has to be really good at what it does. It has to be able to engage the complexities even within the deaf community, and it has to be really good. So it's attractive, and you would choose Gallaudet over some other place where you don't have this opportunity.
Hello there, Dr. Smith. I had a chance to talk with you at lunch. I don't have so much a question as two quick comments. First of all, I teach in the English department, and I teach students, and very often I see that in the first week of the semester, students will be surprised that I'm the teacher because they've never seen a deaf Latino faculty member. And I have to reassure them that I am indeed the teacher. And that has an impact, the relationship that we create with each other. But not just with minority students, also with white students, you know, who may be struggling with English. And so that's one note in having worked here with Gallaudet, and one of the reasons I love working here. The second comment, though, was about the conversations I have with students. Some students who are athletes, for example, will approach me and let me know that the athletic department, athletic director is hiring a new men's soccer coach, for example, and they weren't invited to be in the pool. I can't tell them exactly what they should do to get in the pool, for example, but I can say that you know, we do want to look at social justice, and so that the players as a group could approach the athletic director or anybody in such a position, and to deal with that case. But I have students come and approach me with issues like this because they're comfortable with me. But at the university, I see we have difficulty, drawing and retaining good students. Athletics department does seem to do that, so the hiring of coaches is important. But I see that when the athletic director's attitudes shift away from these existing minority students for those positions, then the university continues, I just don't see how the university can continue and thrive continuing these practices.
And at every local level in a university, somebody knows this is happening. And the question is there a sense that we're moving forward? People are encouraged to speak up, and there will be support for people to intervene. And the intervention is not necessarily a legalistic intervention or a bureaucratic intervention. It may be sitting down and saying, we can't keep doing this. Given our mission, given the diversity of our students, given the diversity of what we're trying to do, we need to make sure we have truly open searches and we are getting diversity. If we keep getting the same usual people, this is not acceptable. So part of this is the alignment question at every level. It has to come from the provost and the deans. It has to come up. People have to feel like this really matters. Somebody's watching. I can just challenge. What I've learned with diversity work, because there are so many intersectionalities here, is I have to sort of be humble in my own life. And the reality is I pick and choose what I pay attention to. When it comes to diversity, I never take my eye off it. It's just what I see. But there are a lot of things that if I don't think I have to pay attention, then I'm busy, so I don't. And what you have to create in the institution is the sense that we're paying attention and we're creating a future that is more diverse, in which students and faculty and staff thrive. And we're watching it at every level. And everybody needs to be empowered and then held accountable at every level. Otherwise, and students can play a huge role in this. I mean, one of the ways students play a role is to organize themselves. Believe me, that's a very powerful thing, especially you don't want to be in the newspaper when they do.
Okay, hello all. What a wonderful presentation. I wish we had even more time because I could listen to Dr. Smith for hour upon hour. I truly could. I so much enjoyed your presentation and working with you over the last 2 days. It has been inspiring, and we're honored to have you be part of our Diversity Advisory Board, which means that you'll be coming back to visit campus yet again. So I want to thank you for an outstanding presentation today, and thank all of you for coming today. Please do fill out your evaluations. Thanks so much.
This has been a production of Gallaudet University.